Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and we're going to really try to integrate emotional intelligence, humor intelligence, and leadership. Let's take a look at the other objectives. Going to distinguish between humor and wit, and hostile and healing humor. Give you some tools and techniques for both being a high-powered humorist and for being more compelling as a communicator. We will go over experiences, especially exercises, where you will have a chance to see how you can create an environment that really gets people involved about serious issues, but they do it in a playful way. And I'll also talk about my passion power model. 5 Ps: purposeful, provocative, passionate, playful, and philosophical. Talk about the intimate foe, and if we have some time, I'll give you some thoughts on how to integrate humor and participatory leadership in your daily or weekly meetings. Okay, let's start with actually that first objective, the beach story. What is that about? Well, years back, I was doing a workshop with IT managers, and one gentleman told the story about how, I guess in about 2005, just before the Iraq war was about to break out, he was at the American Embassy in Iraq, and tension was building between the staff. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty. Is war going to come? You know, if not, and it was leading to tension and sniping between the personnel in the embassy. And one day, the ambassador was talking with his assistant, and he said, "You know what? We're going to go to the beach tomorrow." And the assistant looked at him and said, "Sir, you know, what are you talking about? A war might break out at any time." No, we're going to the beach tomorrow. And I want you to have everybody be prepared, put on, you know, swimwear, and be prepared at 8 o'clock, 800 hours, to go to the beach. The assistant sort of walked off. And sure enough, that next morning, there was the ambassador with a bathrobe and bathing suit holding a rubber ducky. I thought it was a nice touch. And when people were called, you know, to order, of course, he was just about the only one in beach attire. And he said, "You know, you have little faith. We're going to the beach." And sure enough, somehow during the night, he had tons of sand trucked into the compound, and they made a beach big enough to, you know, for people to play. They put up a volleyball net. It was like it broke the tension cycle. Now, here was a really, I think, dynamic leader. One, he recognized, he had the emotional intelligence to really appreciate, you know, the tension going on, how it was impacting his staff. You know, wasn't just telling them to suck it up. He also had a strategy. He understood that physical interaction and playful interaction can break the tension. And I suspect he did not get permission, you know, from the chain of command, basically. He took the initiative. All these qualities really contribute to effective out-of-the-box leadership. And so we want to be able to, you know, tap into this more systematically. Okay, let's move on. So, just some thoughts about humor in general. Much like the wartime, you know, setting in which the ambassador was able to operate, the great film pioneer Charlie Chaplin once said, "A paradoxical thing is that making comedy, excuse me, the tragic is precisely that which arouses the funny. We have to laugh due to our helplessness in the face of natural forces and in order not to go crazy. Basically, this is saying that situations that have a certain amount of tension, uncertainty, as well as some that are tragic, but just enough stress really primes people to be ready to laugh. Because our body knows that, someone once said, laughing with gusto is like turning your body into a big vibrator, giving vital organs a brief but hearty internal massage. Someone else called laughter like inner jogging, because it really does release endorphins and dopamine, kind of feel good and mind calming chemicals. And I remember when I was told that I had a tumor on my thyroid years back, I was able to, come up with some examples of tumor humor, including the saying, half a lobe is better than none, because they did have to cut out my right lobectomy. Well, they did a lobectomy and they cut out my right lobe. And what this really reflects is a statement by a psychiatrist, Ernst Chris, who once said, what did he say? What was once feared and is now mastered is laughed at. What was once feared and is now mastered is laughed at. So we can look back when we're no longer afraid of a person or a situation, and we realize we've confronted it. What was once feared and is now mastered is laughed at. We've learned how to problem solve. And conversely, the stress doc said what was once feared and is now laughed at is no longer a master. So those situations and people that intimidate us, we can perhaps use some humor as a way of putting them and ourselves in a healthier perspective. Let's continue. Now, again, this is a cartoonist who I adapted some of his components, and I call it components of psycho-humorist. See, I call myself a motivational psycho-humorist, and of course, I'll let you all decide where the emphasis on that word should go. But let's take a look at this for a second. When we use humor, are we trying to really kind of recognize the absurdity, if not the absurdity, not the insanity of contemporary life? For example, the title of one of my stress books is Practice Safe Stress. So we know stress can be serious, but by kind of taking, a reference from Practice Safe Sex, it puts it in a lighter perspective. Are the subtle truths in the guise of fantasy? I'm going to talk about an exercise later, that I do with all kinds of company and organizational clients, and it's a drawing exercise where I break up a larger group into small groups and they discuss, an issue, and then they draw a group picture. Sort of they come up with make a cartoon or just some kind of logo, and it's outrageous and fun. And yet he said to me, Mark, I get all kinds of reports, but those pictures, those group pictures, with his company, gave me a better perspective of what's going on in the trenches than anything else that has come across my desk. So even though it might be playful and fantasy, silly, there can be truths because people are feeling less guarded. Can dark fears be framed in a playful or ridiculous light? Well, I talked about how after my lobectomy, my reassuring mantra was, half a lobe is better than none. Now, framing is a very important concept in humor and in leadership. It's the ability to see things from a different perspective. Here I was, looking at my surgery from a lighter perspective. But let me give you a great example of reframing. I used to live in New Orleans, and there was a very busy street for car traffic, Broad Street. And, you'd just be crawling along, and there was this big advertising sign, and the message was really clever. It said, "To you, it's a traffic jam. For us, it's an audience. Advertise here." So look at what they did. One, they recognized two perspectives simultaneously. Perspective of people in traffic, the cars, and the perspective of the sign, high above the traffic, looking down on the traffic. And it made it clear that, if you wanted to advertise, you have a pretty captured audience. You're certainly going to, have opportunity to pay attention to your message. Is it a true example of our social and cultural dilemmas? Of course, this is can be double-edged. I was just in a Courageous Conversations in our county, an event where people of different races and religions come together to just have open discussions about getting to know one another, really. And for example, at the end of this 4-week, symposium, I suppose, we were brainstorming ways that we could extend these conversations after we complete, this 4-week course, and how we can bring it into the community. And it was so interesting that, a couple of people mentioned block parties, but some people were saying, gee, we've tried that, it hasn't worked. But then there were two women of similar religious background who spoke of how they've been very successful generating these parties. And when I was asked to sort of, at the end of the evening, share some of the recommendations from my group, I just said, hey, and one thing I've learned, Muslim women can throw great block parties. Well, that was playful, and it got some laughs. And yet, after I sat down, I was the last one to speak, this Muslim gentleman got up and was concerned that, that kind of message might be interpreted in a, less than respectful manner. Now, he did come over to me to say he wasn't trying to attack me, but he wanted to bring out this point. Fortunately, the Muslim woman, one of the Muslim women, was sitting right next to me, and she liked the fact that I just listened to this man respectfully. But she said, Mark, I was perfectly comfortable with what you said, and you handled it fine. So we need to know that when we're trying to be a little humorous or a little edgy, this may not be comfortable for everyone in our audience. So you need to be prepared not to get defensive. It's not that you've done something wrong, especially unless you were, really consciously trying to be. Unfortunately, some people like to build their egos up at the expense of others. And, I call that sarcasm. And assuming that you're not using that, then just know that being humorous, not everyone has the same appreciation of different kinds of humor. And we'll sort of elaborate more on the different kinds of humor. Are we exposing our innermost inconsistencies? I don't know how many of you have heard the song Tea for Two. That's an old classic, a little silly. But anyway, I came up with a version that sort of pokes fun at all the narcissists that seem to be on the front pages or on the screens of our TV and papers today. I call it Humility for Two, the narcissist version. And very simply, It goes, you for me and me for me. Oh, how nurturing you will be. Forget to be or not to be. Just simply think of me, me, me. And unfortunately, we do know people like that. In fact, I remember a woman coming up to me, oh, could you send me the lyrics? I am going to slip that under the door of someone. Humor is meant to sort of poke a hole in a big ego balloon. And we'll talk more about that. Does it hold our flaws and foibles up to ridicule? I remember some guy on a group a support group I attend was sort of saying how he's not only dealing with depression, but OCD and some addictions. And I said, and I knew the guy, so I'd like it. Hey, this man is self-actualized. So again, you know, we can use humor to lighten a moment, maybe to get someone to take a look at how they're communicating, you know, sort of puffing themselves up. And ultimately, is there some element of it being funny? And that's very important. Now here, so I noticed I've kind of given you some thoughts about humor. But I want to put humor in a larger communication and leadership context. Now here are what I call my 5 A's. Now you'll find out that having lived in the Washington, D.C. area, I am starting a new 12-step AA group called Acronyms Anonymous. So you'll see I tend to use some acronyms. Anyway, let's take a look at this. First, you want to get people's attention. You want to get them to stop, look, and listen. In fact, I just sort of, one of the ways I start a workshop is tell people how, you know, my goal is to help an audience get fit, F-I-T. We're going to have fun, make it interactive and thought-provoking, and to do this, I have my AAA method. We're going to grapple with some anxiety, act out a little aggression, and engage life's slings and arrows with some playful yet purposeful absurdity. You know, so you got anxiety, aggression, absurdity, FIT, AAA, and that's where I tell them, hey, you know, can tell I've been living in Washington too long, and mention my new 12-step AA group, which I then, of course, say, I'm sure some of you are ready to sign up. But that's the point, and especially in this cell phone, you know, everybody's got their head in their phones. Oh, I've come up with a new one. If someone has their head in their phones all the time, you know what they are? A big phony. So hopefully that's might be a way of get people's attention. Stop being such a big phony. It's a good way of kind of getting people to laugh at themselves a little bit, and maybe, you know, shut off the phone and really get their attention, because we've got to do it. People are, you know, just hooked on these phones. I want people to have, you know, anticipate, what is this guy going to do next? He's a little edgy. I want people on the edge of their seats. Also, I hope you can feel some of my animation, my passion, my energy. We want to bring that. Now, it doesn't mean you have to always be in that, you know, high intensity mode. But at the right moment, it really, you're a role model and going to ultimately inspire, not just animate. Especially when we take risks, when we can share, when we do things that, like the ambassador, his actions were inspiring. You know, that he would challenge the system, challenge his own people, do something out of the ordinary by, you know, trucking in the sand. That's what animates. When people sense you're genuine. Remember someone saying to me at a presentation, you couldn't get away with doing the things that you do and saying the things that you say, stress doc, unless people thought you were genuine. And I think she was on target. You want to be passionate, but also genuine. Activation. Now you really want to, you've shared ideas, concepts. Now you want to give people tools, ideas, tools, problem-solving skills, exercises. And I'm going to talk about some of the exercises that I do. that really help bring to life the different leadership ideas, communication ideas that you want to impart, that you want to dialogue with, not just impart, you want to have dialogue with people. And you want this to be an ongoing creative collaborative journey, and that's where people really experience that sense of actualization. It's a, it's not a path to mastery, it's the path of mastery, the lifelong learning process. We want to integrate our emotional intelligence and our humor intelligence in this kind of learning and leadership framework. Move on. Okay, now, so I do have this table on the left side is EQ, or emotional intelligence. And let's take a look at that. Kind of go down the line. First, self-awareness. So here, we need time, and this is why, even though there's a part of me that I tell people I have a stage persona, that animated, I need to also have a cave persona. I need to take time to reflect on not only thinking about my ideas and strategies, but really, what am I feeling? Because our feelings so much shape what we're going to value, where we're going to put our priorities. Are we going to get defensive and reactive, or can we integrate thoughts and feelings to be more responsive? Self-regulation, again, sort of related, getting back to that, is how can I take better control over my emotions so I'm not so reactive or impulsive? And, they talk about count to 10. Yeah, if I start counting to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you bozo. No, I've got to do more than count to 10. I've got to check within, and that is, what am I feeling? What's going on? Is there something? I have to take time to observe myself and then really try to look at the situation, the person or the situation, in a different manner. There's something often about, if I'm feeling so intense and riled up and reactive, something's going on that's more than just my objective perception of the situation. There's a good theory called attribution theory. Basically, it's based on how do we attribute the motivations or actions to other people and to ourselves. In fact, it's called personal attribution is when we explain our own behavior. Situational attribution, or how our behavior, how do we explain our own behavior? And situational attribution is when we attribute the behavior to our environment, and personal is when we attribute behavior to the individual. And the classic example is if a new person starts coming in late, let's say the first 2 weeks, comes in late a few times, and you ask people what's going on with that person, very quickly people are making personal attributions. Oh, they're lazy, they're disorganized, I don't know if they really want to be here. Conversely, if that was you in a new situation, the way you would explain your behavior, chances are there was traffic, my kid got sick, I had to get my kid to the daycare. In other words, do you see what's going on? When you're focusing on other people, you're making a personal attribution. There's something about their personality or character that's coming into play. When you're explaining your own behavior, you're attributing it to environmental obstacles or conditions. And so we can see the bias. So it's very important, if you're going to try to regulate your emotions, you have to be more objective with how you're attributing yours and other people's actions and intentions. Okay, empathy, motivation. So here we want to, really touch people's heads and hearts, give them goals. But see, that's a very important part of motivation is give people goals, but give them the freedom to try to come up with their own way of producing the outcome. Don't just make them drones where they have to follow your footsteps. Absolutely. We want that intrinsic motivation where the person feels, hey, you know, there's something about my problem-solving effort and ingenuity that brought about the results. Empathy. Here, there's two kinds of empathy, and it turns out emotional empathy, you know, where you feel another's pain, you know, that traditionally you're not just walking in their shoes, but as I like to say, feeling their bunions. That is one empathy that tends to work more effectively with people that you're in your in-group. But with people that are on the outside, maybe even adversaries, cognitive empathy is more important, and that is trying to understand why that other person is feeling upset, angry, hurt, feeling marginalized. So it's not just feeling their pain, but it's really trying to understand why are they in pain. And having social skills, certainly we've seen that already with the ambassador, being able to recognize a problem, come up with some creative solutions. Social skills especially is going to involve bringing in a wide variety of people. And then cognitive skills, being able to see the forest from the trees, being logical and psychological. Now, humor intelligence, what that does is adding some humor to the self-awareness really allows to create a sense of response without judgment. You're not driven, let's say, self-transcendence, you're not driven by ego. And you can be inspiring. There are three examples I want to give. First, when I close a workshop, I'm pioneering the field of psychologically humorous rap music, calling it, of course, shrink rap productions. And when I break out into a shrink rap, and I'll give an example a little bit later, people are laughing, but the lyrics are kind of clever, but they're seeing that I know I can't rap or sing but I'm putting on a Blues Brothers hat and black sunglasses and black tambourine, and I'm just having fun. And I'm not worried about if people think I'm, you know, if this is crazy. There's something freeing and inspiring that we don't have to be so worried about what other people are thinking about us. We can just be playful and putting ourselves out there, and that touches people. Another example of an exercise is I call it the intimate foe exercise, F-O-E, fear of exposure, where, and I'll talk a little bit more, but where I basically have people talking about an embarrassing moment and how this just starts out, everybody's a little cautious, but after a while, people start opening up and sharing. They let down their mask. They're getting real. And why would this be so important for leaders to maybe engage in this activity? We'll talk more about that. And finally, the exercise I'm going to walk you through now really gets to both, is inspiring, it's intimate, there's that team synergy. You know that phrase, there's no I in team? Well, I expanded it. There may be no I in team, but there are two I's in winning. And these I's can see winning teams blend individual creativity and interactive community. There's no I in team really denies our diversity. Of course, the ideal, you want to be on the same page, but you want different people to be able to write their own unique signatures on that common page. And Jazz Riff Partners, which really, there's been a book called The Power of Two that talks about the more that you can get different personalities who have some overlap, like John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the Wright brothers, interacting and sort of challenging one another, supporting and challenging one another, that's where you get great creative synergy, you know, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And even more magically, when the parts become partners. And even that phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, what does that mean? Well, it's the relationship amongst the parts, how they communicate with each other, that gives it that added dimension. That 2 plus 2 can equal 5, because you don't just have 4 people or 4 parts, but you have this interplay amongst them. So what's this exercise that I talk about? Well, I call it the 3-step 3D discussion, drawing, and diversity exercise. And basically, you break the large group into teams of 4 or 5 people. And when able, try to create teams so that there's optimal diversity within the teams. You know, managers, employees, frontline employees, men and women, different minorities, different rank. Get that optimal diversity. Why is this important? Well, one, because sometimes these people don't really talk with one another much, so they don't really know what's going on with each other. Second, there was a submarine study many decades ago, so it only involved men, but they found, it was like a problem-solving study, and they found invariably that the most heterogeneous groups, the most diverse groups, ones with, least commonality, invariably had the more creative problem-solving solutions. Now, why would that be? Because when people are so homogeneous, just one of a kind, it's efficient. That is, you get a quick answer. But in fact, heterogeneity, diversity challenges you. It challenges you to see different perspectives, not just your in-group perspective. And that, while it may take longer, seem to invariably force them to come up with a more creative, bigger picture. So this is one of the reasons you want to create that diversity, as well as so people understand, so the manager gets to better understand the employee's perspective, and vice versa. Okay, so with this exercise, you can almost have any kind of topic. One is, frequent sources of stress and conflict in your everyday operations, or what are the obstacles to more effective teaming? What might be the obstacles to more effective communication, in the division? So you can tailor the question and give people, usually, give them about a 5 to 7 minute time frame. And then I tell them that there's also going to be a drawing portion, not just discussion. You're going to come up with a logo, a cartoon, a storyboard, a Dilbert cartoon. Now, I'll give you an example. So in one group, I was brought in because there was real problems in the engineering company, and the CEO was, I was going to say he was running the company in the ground. The problem was he was hardly running the company. Basically he was going off flying his little airplane. Well, in this particular group, we did this drawing exercise, and this one team came up with this perfect picture. They came up with this picture of this big Troublesaurus, big dinosaur, called it a Troublesaurus, that was stalking the plant, and all these little people are scattering in fear, except one person, bigger than the rest, has his back to the dinosaur, totally oblivious, has his head in the clouds, and is watching planes fly by. Certainly, that's a powerful image. Now, in addition to giving that image, you need, I tell the groups, you need a recorder, someone who can, jot down your group's discussion points before you're going to do the drawing. And I also tell people, share at the level at which you feel comfortable. This is not true confessions, but, just stating that, saying that, not telling people, you got to really be honest, and it frees people up to share more than they might normally. And then towards the end of that 7-minute discussion period, I start handing out the flip chart paper. I really like to get, these 5 colors because they're often very expressive, emotionally expressive colors: red, yellow, blue, black, and green. So, and then after we finish the discussion part, then the drawing exercise, I really try to let people know, I give them instructions. We'll also draw for about 7 minutes. Make big images, lots of color. Try to have everybody participate. Hey, if you have someone who's a real artist, okay, they can do the basic stuff, but everybody should be drawing something. And of course, I give them a reminder what their music teacher, their fourth grade music teacher probably said, hey, have you thought about, or I'm sorry, it's not their music teacher, it's their art teacher. But their art teacher finally said, hey, have you thought about music? So anyway, my mistake, but that happens. Okay. And during the exercise, both the discussion part and the drawing part, I try to give people 2-minute and 30-second warnings to wrap up. And then there's a couple of options. If you have a little more time after the drawing part, you can do a gallery walk around, which is, I think, a great way to, what I do tell groups is don't talk about your picture, your team's picture, but you can make comments about the other team's picture. And that really gets a chance for everyone to really eyeball and get a perspective of what the different teams, how they're viewing, the work world on a daily basis. And then we finally have a show and tell. And there I ask people to be, one person be a reporter, and the other person, and then choose a holder. And of course little smart guys say, and not everybody volunteered to be the holder. So, because people don't want to be the reporter. Anyway, the energy is terrific when people start telling their stories. Some groups come up all as a group. And then once everyone group has had a chance to show off their pictures, and most of the time, every group wants to be involved, we do an exercise debrief. What made this exercise useful? Was it useful? Was it enjoyable? What worked? And invariably, you get people talking about how they felt that different parts of their brain was opening up, and it was really a lot of fun, kind of jazz riffing with their team members. And what was clear is while they were talking about real issues that could be very frustrating, there was an atmosphere of play and high energy. It did not feel like a gripe session. So I hope this gives you, a real in-depth feel of how you can use exercises as a way to really engage a team or group or division or whole company. Okay, I don't know if I'm going to go into, because we're, moving along at a much faster pace than I would like to, but let me tell you about this gospel grief rap story. That fine line between the comic and tragic, the hopeful and hurtful. So I was brought in to this government agency to deal with I think a beloved supervisor had committed suicide. And I wound up meeting with this, I don't know, it must have been about 15, 20 people. The first time, and before I even met with the whole group, one of the team members who was a former policeman, and now I might have done some security. Anyway, he started questioning me, basically, what makes you think you can come in and, do anything with us? So, probably said a few things, but so anyway, the first day there really wasn't, that much openness. People were kind of feeling pretty tense and, close to the vest. But I came back, I think 2 days later, and this guy was still after me a little bit. I don't know, somebody came up about being creative, or that I do writing, and he said, what kind of writing? And I said, well, kind of poetry. Why don't you recite something? Well, he didn't know, as I said, he was dealing with the guy pioneering the field of psychologically humorous rap music, calling it shrink rap productions. And I broke it out into, when it comes to feelings, do you stuff them inside? It's Tough John Wayne, your emotional guide. And it's not just men so proud and tight-lipped. For every Rambo, there seems to be a Rambette. And you know what? For the first time, these people started relaxing, started smiling, even started clapping to my, crazy lyrics. And it was like they were now having permission to be able to be more fully themselves, to be both sad, but to also have, see the light, as it were. And in fact, it really opened up the group to talk about how much they missed the supervisor, how some of them understandably were angry at that person because she didn't give any clues. She was a great actress. And so it came as pretty much of a shock. Or people reflected that, maybe I should have been aware of this, but she was holding her cards close to her vest. And it then allowed people to really do another exercise that I like to use, is where people talk about identify what were the strengths of this person that you've lost, what made them special, and then challenging people, can you come up with a way of integrating that strength? You admire this strength, how can you build that more into your day-to-day life? So by just using humor as a tool to break down the oppressive weight that people were feeling because of this tragic event, doesn't in any way mean we're minimizing the tragedy, but we're saying, as Charlie Chaplin did, comedy and tragedy are very closely wed, and we need both to have a whole life. Serious and the silly. In my stress webinars, I'll often ask examples of, how do people know how does your brain, body, and behavior let you know when you're under more stress than usual? I call that my stress barometer exercise. And some example might be eating. And I say, sure, how many people eat a little bit more to numb that anxious feeling in their gut? And a lot of hands go up. And then I ask, are there any folks that lose their appetite when they're under stress? And a few hands flutter. And I say, yeah, and we hate those people. And of course, that gets a big laugh. So again, you want to help people laugh at their own flaws and foibles, their own silliness, their own, humanness. Oh, another one is TMJ. We know what TMJ really stands for. That's that kind of jaw, clenching of the jaw, TMJ. And then I say, too many jerks. And again, people laugh knowingly. Okay, and we'll see, really an important part of humor, especially as a leader, is to be able to use self-effacing humor, where we sort of poke fun at ourselves. And I remember reading that there's 3 aspects of self-effacing humor that people recognize. One is affirmation. You're standing, you're affirming yourself. I think they gave an example of a woman who was overweight, but her response was, hey, if I was in India, people would think I was sacred. So that took a lot of gutsiness, but she wasn't ashamed of who she was, or she knew how to purposefully sort of make light of it. So there's that, you're affirming yourself, people accept your courage, and there's also an aggression aspect. That is, when people are sort of trying to put you down or criticize or playfully, or sarcastically, hey, if that's your best shot, if you think you're making fun of me and that's the best you can do, you don't know the half of my story. Again, there's this, you think you can make fun of me, I can do it a lot better than you can. And so it's not really just putting yourself down or playing on your foibles. There's an aggressive, hey, I can handle myself in this situation component to this self-effacing humor. Now, there are large functions of humor. We've talked about most of these. The laughing with gusto is like turning your body into a big vibrator, giving vital organs a brief but hearty internal massage. We've certainly talked about the absurdity. The insight and incongruity, Arthur Kessler wrote a very powerful book called The Act of Creation. It's a huge work. But he recognized the mental and vocal connection between art appreciation, between scientific discovery, art appreciation, and humor and laughter. Basically, in all three of these activities, we recognize some connection between things that normally seem contradictory or discrepant, and we put it together and say, in art appreciation, we go, ah. In scientific discovery, we go, aha. And when we laugh, it's ha ha. So there's this humor has a strong cognitive component of putting things together and helping others put things together that they didn't normally associate. Like, for example, when I said people that, are always on their smartphones, they're big phonies. So again, it just takes a little shift, maybe one or two words, but it puts things in a different perspective. Now, of course, one of the problems is sometimes people use hostile humor to put people down to build themselves up, and we'll hopefully have time for a story on that. Now, humor is basically recognizing the incongruities in a person or in a situation. We can laugh at our flaws and foibles, while wit is the more cognitive, making a connection between things. Mark Twain said, for example, wit is the sudden marriage of ideas which before their union were not perceived to have any relation. And it comes quick. Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit. Let me go into this a little bit more. So humor is saying things in a funny way. Wit is saying funny, sharp things. Humor also involves what is being observed. Let me give you a good example of one that's really both, what is observed and what is being mentally constructed. So this organization was going through a lot of digital change. This was a number of years back. And basically the change was mandated, imposed, especially people who were most directly impacted were not given opportunity to, comment, give feedback, or share their thoughts about the change process. And not surprisingly, instead of using some of the new data processing procedures, some people started going back to using the old forms. And of course, management's response was frustration, and people are being resistant. And I said, I'm not sure if it's all resistance. I think there's a grief process going on. Not only are people kind of concerned about that the changes and they've lost some of the areas of familiarity where they've built up some expertise and it's a new challenge, but I think they're really feeling overlooked and devalued. No one thought that their input, those people who are really doing the work, was important enough to be asked questions or given a chance to be part of the problem-solving process. So I think we made a mistake on the front end, but we have an opportunity. I think we need to have a forms funeral. Well, of course, they were initially our forms, but we did it. And then basically it was like, speaking at a funeral. The employees had a chance to give their eulogy, what they're going to miss about the old system, some of their concerns in the new, and especially their concern about how this system was implemented, where there was no opportunity for input, just being mandated from top down. And fortunately, leadership were able to also be part of this funeral service and said, yes, we made a mistake not taking enough time, feeling the time pressure and just mandating this. Next time, we need to get more input from everyone. So, and sure enough, when they took that strategy, when this whole funeral, construction was completed, sure enough, the employees were ready to give the new technology a fair shake. And so this is where we really can come up with different strategies. Someone said, Humor is like letting air out of the balloon. It's slow, it's silly, and it sputters around. Where wit, and we have to be careful, is sharp. We can stick a pin into a balloon, and it can be deflating, and too much, it can be sarcasm. Let me give you a quick example of where I may have engaged in a little bit of what someone could feel like ridicule, even though I don't think that was my intention. So I'm out in Salt Lake City working for a federal government, doing 2 days of workshops, stress and burnout. And we had the first day, and I thought it went pretty well, and as a sign of that, someone just on their own volunteered to buy some donuts and pass them out. But this one guy stands up, who, as it turns out, people were aware of his energy, shall we say. And he says, how can you, as a stress expert, condone passing out sugar donuts? That's unhealthy, and that has nothing to do with good stress management. You know, and I guess I took a breath and said, well, yeah, I agree. Nutrition is important. And, you know, too much sugar donuts is not good for your health. However, sometimes, you know, people are just, there's a social component here. People are expressing their appreciation of what went on, you know, what they're sharing, learning. And sometimes that can be stress relieving, not from the nutrition point of view, but from the morale point of view. Well, he was totally set in his ways, and he was still kind of criticizing me. And at some point, I also knew as a leader, I had to somewhat take control of the situation, or people would begin to question my ability. So I finally said, even though I was really trying, I thought I was kind of poking fun of myself, I said, well, I can only think of Ralph Waldo Emerson's quote, consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So I was sort of saying that I wasn't being consistent. But a woman in the audience called out, oh, that's a good one. And this guy felt deflated and, you know, sort of slunk down into his chair. And we can make a case that did I sort of, you know, go a little too far in my challenge with him. And yet, even if we make that case, let's continue the story a little bit, because sure enough, in the afternoon, he finally, I guess, had been, you know, couldn't just attack me, had to look at himself a little bit more, and finally stood up and said, yeah, I guess I realized I've been burnt out for a good while. And then people in the audience could acknowledge it. Yes, they have felt this negative energy, and they would not talk about it, and they didn't know how to approach him. So it took that kind of confrontation for him to be ready to look at himself in a more realistic way. So this is very important. So we want to speak people's language for credibility and trust. I remember working with on an independence program with some women who, you know, were on getting social services support, and I wrote a song for them at their graduation called Welfare Mama Lion. And they, you know, and it really captured their qualities as people. And they were so touched. And there was some humor in it. But so what I'm saying is, when we, you know, really project a kind of little creativity and humor and share that with people, it really is a great connector. Of course, we talked about self-effacing humor, and you know, when I get a little too high horse, I can say, you know, hey, you know, vanity, thy name is Gorkin. Why my nonverbal mannerisms? And then, of course, the tone of your voice, the pacing, the volume, arm gestures, facial expression, all this really is important in your projecting yourself as a high-impact communicator, as a humorist. In fact, for example, when I tell people my mantra, my goal in life, to be a wise man and a wise guy, and you can see the different tone in my voice, the different energy. We talked about my shrink wrap, and the cartoons that we used in the drawing exercise. Now here, another example of where funny sex, where humor has to be aware of cultural relevance. In New Orleans, I would close a workshop with, laughter is the best tension reliever and sex is second. So if you're having funny sex, you're probably in good shape. In fact, one association had, hey, we're going to have to bring you back to talk about funny sex. In Washington, D.C., a little bit more, formal. There were people who were uncomfortable with that comment. So I had to come up with another closing. Hopefully we've been talking about wordplay and punning and, throughout. Let's see what other key techniques. Understatement, emphasizing the obvious. I remember this guy had been a little cold and cruel, and not cruel, but unaware. And he was very well dressed and very dapper looking, but he was unaware of some of the negative feedback he was giving to his younger female partner. And I remember saying, boy, when I could see that she was pained by his kind of a little bit harsh feedback or insensitive, and I said, boy, this guy broke a lot of hearts when he was younger. And he laughed, and the tension in the room, abated. So paradoxical, analogous, inside your car, in one of my shrink wraps, inside your car looks like a pocketbook of wheels. Talked about reframing. Timing. Also content, be aware of the context. With the military, I often would use the serenity, talk about the serenity prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things, and with other groups actually, to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know where to hide the bodies. Of course, with the military, I wasn't going to say with the wisdom to know where to hide the bodies. I changed it, the wisdom to know where to hide the money. So again, like a saying, reversal, do know your limits and don't limit your nose. So there's different ways. Now, let me just on closing, let me tell you about a model that I created. Just a final thought as we close. Basically, a group once asked me, how do you give dynamic presentations? And I said, I like to use my head and heart. I like to be cognitive. I like to be affective. And that's the mindset. But also there's the mood set. I like to be serious, or gravitas, a good Washington, D.C. word, as well as comedic, or I can talk about commedia because we know there are different kinds of comedy, humor, wit, slapstick, improvisation. There's all kinds of comedy. But if you take those four boxes, those dimensions, cognitive, affective, gravitas, comedia, and you play a game, what comes to mind when you hear cognitive and gravitas? Being purposeful, having an aim, looking for meaning. Cognitive and comedia, being provocative, which comes from the French provoquer, which means to arouse the curiosity, to stimulate the mind. As a leader, do I want to be provocative? Absolutely. I want to challenge people out of their comfort zones. What about gravitas and affective? Be passionate. Now, passion is a very interesting word. It's not the three-letter S word, sex, but the 9-letter S word, suffering, as in the Passion play, the sufferings of Jesus, or more generically, the sufferings of a martyr. Of course, I say, imagine all this time I never knew my Jewish mother was such a passionate woman. So, again, being silly. And affective and comedia, playful. Really trying to touch people's spirit. And I've even pushed it now to have the 5 P's and 6 E's to compel and captivate. Purposeful is educating. Provocative, energizing. Passionate, empathizing. playful, entertaining, and philosophical, the fifth P, engaging and enlightening. And how do I turn this into an exercise? Well, two ways. One, I'll break people into small groups, and again, have them, which is your strength? Most people, know how to be purposeful, some know how to be provocative, but a lot of people have a hard time being playful, or maybe less able to be provocative. Anyway, I pair people up in the group. Try to talk with someone. If your strength is being purposeful, but you want to strengthen being playful, find someone to talk to who can, you can dialogue, where each can help another with the other's area of strength. And then I close with my 4-word exercise. And the way I lead up to it is I ask the group, can you imagine someone being purposeful, provocative, passionate, playful, maybe even philosophical, all at the same time? Is that conceivable? Well, let's try my 4-word exercise. You ready? Share an embarrassing moment, begin. And of course, there's a silence and a little nervous laughter maybe, but someone starts, and then, and then someone after they first guy or gal finishes says, hey, that was good. Let me tell you about my experience. And suddenly the room is abuzz with energy, body language, people standing up, giving. People are beginning to be purposeful, provocative, passionate, playful, and philosophical. And why do I really want leaders to engage in this exercise? Because the more as a leader that you can take off your mask, your be perfect, have to have everything together, everything under control mask, you're not only having people look at you as being, wow, this guy's or gal's pretty courageous. They can be real, they can be authentic, but you're a role model for the others. Maybe I don't have to be so worried about making a mistake, and maybe I can be more forthright about what's really going on with me, or, in the work process. And because, as I said, that commander, he wants to know what's going on in the trenches. And they have what they call helmets off meetings, where they really want to, no rank in the room. They want people to speak up. If you want people to speak up, you've got to be authentic. You've got to be able to really set the stage for that it's okay to talk honestly about our mistakes, how we can improve, what's really going on. So taking off that mask is one of the real great skills and strategies of leadership.